in that case, extinction stuff. So we now live in an era where there's the Endangered Species Act. We are abundantly aware that populations of organisms go completely extinct. And this is kind of one of the things that I initially talked about when we were very first talking about adaptive evolution. There's this kind of tendency of people to think, oh, evolution solves problems and populations of organisms adapt to their circumstances and they get better and better and better at making a living wherever they live. That's adaptive evolutionary change, right? You can get kind of trapped into thinking that that is the typical outcome for populations of organisms throughout time. And it is for within lineage change, within kind of limits and within bounds, but there are limits. What happens if the selection pressure is extremely strong and there's limited genetic variation and limited number of generations to respond to selection? What happens instead? Organisms fail to adapt in ways that are sort of seemingly catastrophic, but they have interesting other kinds of implications for the rest of biotic evolution. Now, in our time, we take extinction as known. It was not an accepted idea as recently as, within the last 150 or so years, and that was basically a sort of theological bias saying, if God made a perfect creation and these animals and plants and whatever, then they can't disappear. And in the colonial era of Western European exploration around the world seemed very big, and it seemed possible that there were things still surviving out there that weren't apparent to us. So you could find fossils of things that you no longer found in Western Europe, but you could kind of argue, well, maybe they're still out there somewhere, right? And that's really changed with the exploration of the world and the documentations of extinctions of many populations of organisms that went hand in hand with European colonization of the world. So from a biological point of view, we're now kind of at the point where we would say that extinction is actually kind of the normal fate of species. This is a normal process of turnover of biological diversity. It's somehow unsurprising in some kind of long-term sense. And you can even characterize what typical levels of extinction are, and that's what's called the background extinction rate. You can also characterize what you'd call a sort of typical species longevity, as well as a variety of factors that affect variation around that kind of typical longevity. And against that background extinction rate, you can see periods of time with really highly elevated extinction rates. Those are called mass extinctions. We'll talk about them. And in a sense, from an evolutionary point of view, the importance of those is that they can then lead to subsequent adaptive radiation and turnover of the flora and fauna and these big steps of macroevolutionary change, right? Not just within lineage microevolutionary change. So those are kind of the topics of the day. And here's some data on kind of typical extinction rates. So if you look on this is a log linear plot. This is a log scale you can see here. What you get are fairly linear rates of extinction. That suggests a constant proportional to time rate of extinction for a number of different lineages. And what's interesting about this is that you can see that what that rate is can depend on the types of organisms that you're talking about. So we'll just blow this up here. One thing that makes you as an entire species less likely to go extinct is that you occupy a very large geographic range. That seems super intuitive, right? Whereas species that have very narrow niches, very narrow geographic ranges, they're much more likely to go extinct, one would think, right? And these data show exactly that same kind of pattern. So geographic ranges in red are less than 1,000 kilometers, and they tend to, they follow, this line, they tend to die out more rapidly than species with really big geographic ranges in green, right? But still, within those groups, you get a relatively constant kind of rate of extinction. So from this kind of data, people can extrapolate to sort of average extinction rates, right? And so about 1 million years is, with a lot of variation around it, but about 1 million years is kind of a typical number that paleontologists identify as a lifespan of a species, as it were. So you can look at those typical kinds of rates, and that gets you a graph that's kind of like this, perhaps, that has these little ups and downs. This is percent extinction on this axis versus time, geological time. You get this kind of level about here, little fluctuations up and down around it. That's the kind of typical normal background extinction rate that you'd get from these log linear curves of species longevity. Then that highlights these periods of really high rates of extinction that far exceed that, quote, normal background extinction rate. And those are, of course, these points up here. And, we've talked about those points in some other contexts, right? The geological record and the history of life was not marked by radiometric, isometric dating of things. It was established by the turnover of fossil assemblages of organisms. So these different peaks are when paleontologists identified the wholesale sort of reassembly of life on Earth, and that's why they correspond to those geological ages. So in the Phanerozoic, does everyone remember what the word Phanerozoic means? Phanerozoic does not mean really old. Phanerozoic means the visible life. So it is the period of life since the Cambrian explosion. So when you had relatively large-bodied multicellular organisms in the fossil record, that's the after the Cambrian explosion, right? The before the Phanerozoic is the Precambrian era, where life is mostly unicellular. So in this multicellular life, you have 5 of those big extinction peaks, where maybe 60% of species died in some marine mollusk groups, and something like 90% of all genera died. It is a complete turnover of the kinds of organisms that are inhabiting the Earth at that time. And they're important because that opens up ecological space for other kinds of organisms. So we talk about organisms having an ecological niche and utilizing resources, and their kind of life history converts those resources into offspring at some kind of rate. And we talked about R-selected species and K-selected species. K-selected species are highly competitive equilibrium type species that utilize those resources. Those kinds of communities are, in a sense, resistant to invasion by other kinds of organisms. So when these groups die off, then that enables other groups to adapt and become specialists on those kind of resources. So we kind of mentioned this already, that the extinction of the dinosaurs was a major factor in, a sense, releasing the mammals from competition to the point where they could diversify. You recall from the timeline of life, mammals, early mammals were concurrent with most of the age of dinosaurs, but mammals were, you know, little scrubby things that run around at night. They weren't big grazers, they weren't big predators. All those ecological niches were filled by dinosaurs until they get wiped out, and then you get this potential for adaptive radiation. So it's important kind of in this context to think about extinction now. So we say, all right, this is a normal evolutionary ecological process, but if you look at biodiversity now and the population of humans and how we extract resources from the earth, which is in a sense our niche, right? That the percentage of the land area that is taken over by humans for our extractive purposes, primarily of agriculture, is enormous, and that obviously makes that habitat unavailable for other organisms. So as humans have spread around the world, there's lots of associated extinction kinds of events, and you hear about these things. And this appears to be something that is very typical of human expansion around the globe, regardless of sort of which group of humans we're talking about. In other words, this isn't just European colonialists going around the world destroying stuff. It also happened with Polynesians. It also happened with the Aboriginal Australians. It also happened with the Amerindians coming into North America. So here's data with Polynesians getting onto the various islands throughout the South Pacific. So it's estimated, based on bones and things, that about 2,000 bird species went extinct as humans colonized the Pacific Islands. Now let's put that in a little bit of context. There's today recognized between 9,000 and 10,000 bird species. So that's, you know, proportionally almost like 20% of bird species going extinct as people colonized the Pacific Islands. There's major causes on these islands, or these island extinctions, is hunting, the introduction of rats, dogs, pigs. We already saw that if you have a very small, restricted geographic range, you're much more likely to go extinct. That's the kind of situation that exactly describes these small Pacific Island populations. They were relatively shielded from competitive pressure and predation pressure for thousands of years, and then you get introduced rats, dogs, pigs, people, guns, stuff like that, and they're relatively defensive. This is why it's so cool to go to the Galapagos Islands, because the animals don't have a long evolutionary history with predators like people, so you can go right up to a marine iguana, you can go right up to seals and stuff like that. They don't run away from you, which was greatly to the detriment of other island animals as people spread around. Let's see, what else do we have? North American Pleistocene megafauna. That's a mouthful. What's a Pleistocene megafauna? Big, mega big. Fauna? Big animals. So what are the big animals from the Pleistocene in North America? Hard to picture it. Go to La Brea Tar Pits. How many of you have been to La Brea Tar Pits? All right, you went in high school or something probably, right? What do they have there? Mammoths, giant bison, camels, sloths, those huge saber-toothed cat things, right? All right, so La Brea Tar Pits is a good example. Failing that, how many of you saw the movie Ice Age? All right, so there you go. There's also your Pleistocene megafauna. These things died off at about the same time that humans arrived across the Bering Strait. The Bering Strait, not the Bering Street. And this is likely to be due to a combination of both hunting and climate change. The early people into North America hunted with these giant spears called Clovis point spears, and were very efficient at hunting these large animals. From life history theory and RNK selection and stuff, what do you know about large animals? Long gestation. What's the reproductive, the sort of potential reproductive rate of large animals like woolly rhinos, camels, woolly mammoths, giant ground sloths, relative to smallish things? Very low, right? So there's a a kind of fundamental biological difference that makes them more likely to go to extinction as a result of hunting pressure, but also due to some climate changes the Pleistocene ended. Okay, so what we're calling modern, which is, say, in the last 400 years or so, it's relatively few compared to the initial spread of people around the world. It's it's a handful by comparison. Today, the major issues are habitat loss, which then, of course, is again mostly for agricultural purposes in that and Walmart's stores. But here's some kind of dramatic aerial views of forest cover. The top one is a county in England called Warwickshire, and what you guys probably can't see, let me boost this up, see if you can make it visible, is the date. So the green is forest, right? And what I want you to see here is this is about 400 whatever they call that, Common Era, and this is the 1960. So that's roughly a 1,500-year span of clearance of forests for agricultural and pastoral use, and the total reduction in forest covers is huge. Now, the middle is Costa Rica, the whole country of Costa Rica, but the time scale is completely different. I don't know, can you guys see this? That's 1940, and that's 1983. I can't read it because I'm too close to it. I need longer arms. So that's that is a 40-year span of deforestation in Costa Rica, which is if you're thinking about the time scale at which populations of organisms can adapt to various sorts of ecological changes, that 40-year span is not allowing that. It's a wholesale turnover of the flora and fauna. Now, Costa Rica is an interesting one to pick because it currently has one of the best conservation plans of any neotropical Latin American country. And there is now more forest in Costa Rica that is what's called secondary forest, meaning it's regrown, than there is primary forest, meaning it was originally standing. So there's currently a lot of regrowth of forest stuff in Costa Rica, but obviously the plants can return to an area and grow much more rapidly than animals can return to an area. So you have this situation where you might have forests that look pretty good, but there's not a lot of mammals or birds or snakes or stuff in there. There's the U.S. Obviously, the major thing is the loss of the big eastern deciduous hardwood forests, again, basically for agriculture. What's that? That's over 300 years.